Here with my grandpa Marky, and I'm going to interview him about his family history. So the first question I have is, where did your family come from?
Well, the family originally came from Russia and the Ukraine. My grandparents are from, two are from Russia and two are from the Ukraine, and they immigrated to the United States at the beginning of the 20th century. One of my grandfathers was a soldier in 1906 in the Russo-Japanese War, and because he was Jewish, the Russians, who were very anti-Semitic, used the Jews as the front line of defense against the enemy, and they put them there without any weapons. My grandfather was a pretty smart guy, and he realized without a weapon he was not going to do very well, so he ran away and escaped. They caught him and put him back on the front lines, but he escaped again, and he made it this time and came to the United States, where he settled first in New York for a short time and then moved to Pittsburgh, where he met my grandmother, and they got married. That was my mother's father, on my mother's side. On my father's side, my father's father was a socialist in the parties during the revolution in Russia in 1917, but he was on the wrong side of the Bolsheviks who won the revolution, so he left Russia. It was either that or be killed. Those are very dangerous times. He came to the United States and settled down also in Pittsburgh, where he met my grandmother. They married, and my father's father proceeded to have 13 children.
Wow.
And my father, whose name was Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R, was the youngest of all the children. My mother's side, her mother had 4 children, and she was one of 4. She was the only girl in the family. How many more questions do you have? I go on forever, you know me.
I have 5 more questions.
Okay.
But you answered some of them already.
Okay.
So, how do you know all of this?
How do I know all of this?
Yes.
Well, this was part of my family was always very proud of its history. And when I was a kid, I knew my grandfather. I didn't know my father's father because he died when my father was still young. But I knew my other grandparents, and they would tell me stories about their life in Russia or in the Ukraine, what it was like, and my parents would also tell me stories about their youth and what it was like growing up. They were very poor, and what it was like growing up in Pittsburgh, where they grew up. So basically, word of mouth, they told me about this. Hold on for 1 second. I just have to do this tomato sauce. That's not part of the interview.
Yeah, I can cut it out.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I did it. That's good. Okay. So that's basically how I know all this.
Okay. And how many generations can you trace back from your parents?
Well, basically, I could trace it back to my grandparents. I never was able to trace it beyond that. I knew, in terms of the actual individuals, I didn't know much about my great-grandparents, but I did know this, that they all grew up. My grandfather on my father's side grew up in one of the big cities in Russia, which was St. Petersburg. But the other 3 grandparents grew up in the small little towns in Russia that were known as Geshtetl, which means, very poor farming villages where Jewish people live and eat day out of the earth. I don't know about who my great grandparents were, but I know this was the place that they came from. This was probably for many generations they lived in these surroundings.
Do you know if we have any veterans in our family?
My brother, by our family, I can't speak for Jean, your grandmother. Her father, Jean's father, was a veteran, and he fought. He's Canadian. You have a very interesting family. He fought in the Second World War, so he's a veteran of the Second World War. And my own brother was in the Coast Guard, so he went into the Army. I myself was not in the Army.
Mm-hmm.
And my father, in the Second World War, he had 4 kids at the time, or 3 kids at the time, and he went to sign up to register for the Army in 1944 toward the end of the Second World War, and they told him it's better you go home and take care of your family, you know.
Okay.
So he was the veteran. So that's what I know about the veterans. And as I said, my grandfather fought for the Russians without a rifle.
Yeah.
He ran away.
Yeah.
Smarter than he was.
I have 2 questions left. Can you tell me any interesting stories about your family?
Any interesting stories about my family? Well, let me think of the interesting stories. My family, when I was very young, moved from Pittsburgh to New York. My father worked for the Associated Press. He was a teletype operator, which was a way to communicate in the 40s, 50s, and 60s before the internet, the way that newspapers would communicate with each other. And he was a incredibly fast typist. He was really excellent. He won contests in speed of typing. And he got a job he worked for the Associated Press, got a job in New York. And he came to New York. And my parents settled down in Forest Hills. I was about 3 years old at the time. And one summer they decided to take a room in the Rockaways. And this is the 1950s. The Rockaways, which is on the beach. That's where I grew up. And they liked it so much that they stayed there. But the problem was when we first moved there, it was the beginning of the polio epidemic. And my parents were very afraid because at that time it was me and my sister and my little brother Mitchell, and we were very young. And every day you would hear ambulances coming up and down the street to take care of the kids who were stricken with polio and taken to hospitals. So my parents were very afraid of living there, but it was all over polio. So they decided to move into the Rockaways. And one of the things I remember about the Rockaways was that 2 things I can tell you. One is that at the end of the Second World War, which is 1945, they were, toward the end of the war, there was a fear of an invasion by the Germans into New York, and because they had spotted some submarines off the coast. And I lived a block from the beach, and the beach was just covered with tanks and soldiers, and that was all very scary. And I have memory of that when I was very young.
Wow.
I was 39, I was about 6 years old. But not long after that, the war was over, and my next memory is people running out in the streets, banging their pots and pans, celebrating the end of World War II. So those are 2 memories I have of the and another memory I have, I don't know if it's a family memory, but certainly important for me, and that was during World War II when I was a kid, you couldn't get bubble gum because, as if that were important, but for some reason it was important. gum because whatever you needed in the bubble gum to make the bubble gum was material needed for the war effort. So you couldn't get bubble gum. And I had an uncle who worked in a bubble gum factory, and he was able to bring me a box of bubble gum when the war was over, and I was the most popular kid in town because I had bubble gum. I do remember that. It was a very happy memory with the end of World War II. But I did love living in, my family loved living in Rockaway. And I remember the hurricanes that came through the area, blowing the waves from the beach down to our block, where, down to our house, into our basement. But those are a lot of my memories,
Those are good stories.
I'm glad you like it.
So my last question is, do you have any genealogical records of your family?
And the answer to that is no. I haven't done that. And Jean, your grandmother, she knows a little bit more about her family than I know about mine, and she has all kinds of knowledge of some of her past relatives, but I don't have too much. I had a cousin who did some genealogy of our family. He was my father's brother's kid, so he was a cousin on my father's side, and he's the one who told me all about my grandfather, how my grandfather was basically a revolutionary, and I think that's a very great tradition to be proud of in our family.
Yeah.
I don't know if you teach her like that, but I like it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for speaking with me today. I really enjoyed hearing the history of your family.
Yeah, okay, and when we meet again, I'll give you even more stories.
Sounds good.
Okay, sweetheart. Great talking to you.